Welcome back, everyone. Now the technology session 3, carbon dioxide removal technologies shall commence. First, I would like to introduce 3 moderators for this session. Mr. David Sandoval, Dr. Ismail Salagalden, and Professor Sally Benson. Mr. Sandoval is an ICEF Steering Committee member, a inaugural fellow at the Center of Global Energy Policy at the Columbia University, and co-director, Energy and Environmental Concentration at the School of International and Public Affairs at the Columbia University. And Dr. Salagalden is also an ICEF Steering Committee member, Emeritus Librarian of Alexandria, and founding director of the Library of Alexandria. And Professor Benson is also ICEF Steering Committee member and Deputy Director of Chief Strategist for the Energy Transition at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And now, I would like to ask Mr. Sandoval to moderate the session. So Mr. Sandoval, if you please.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone in the room here in Tokyo. Good afternoon and good evening to people around the world who are joining in. I'm really looking forward to this session, which is on one of the most important topics in addressing the fight against climate change, and that's carbon dioxide removal. The science is absolutely clear. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has spoken unambiguously about this, that we will not reach the climate change goals agreed to at Paris without carbon dioxide removal, and indeed without a lot of it. We are going to need to scale up the technology of carbon dioxide removal in a very significant way in the decades ahead, or we're going to face calamitous problems with respect to climate change. And let's be clear, we need to do this in addition to transitioning our energy systems towards zero carbon energy, in addition to transitioning our food systems to a zero carbon approach, and much more. I find in dialogue around the world that often renewable energy gets the most attention in discussions on this topic, and we've had great successes in renewable energy. We need to do much more, but that's not going to be enough. We're going to need to decarbonize the power sector, industry, aviation, the food system, and then we're going to need carbon dioxide removal in order to make this all work. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We have an all-star cast, and we'll get into it get into their presentations in one moment. I just want to say that for those of you who are interested in this topic, ICEF has supported a series of roadmaps, several of which have been on this topic. And so if you're interested in direct air capture, if you're interested in carbon dioxide utilization, if you're interested in carbon mineralization, please go to the website for the ICEF roadmap process, and you will find deeper dives on this topic. And we're actually releasing today, or we released yesterday, a booklet that summarizes all of the ICEF roadmaps, including many on this topic. So with that, as I said, we really have an all-star cast, and I'm thrilled that we're going to start right here in the room with Dr. Jennifer Wilcox, who's a senior official at the U.S. Department of Energy. She's Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. In addition to that, I noticed that on her Twitter profile, she leads not with her work on this, but by saying that she is a mother and a pilot. So Jennifer, that's a really interesting combination. Look forward to hearing from you about carbon removal, being a pilot, motherhood, whatever you like to talk about.
To be in the room and be part of this discussion. So I'm going to start by talking about carbon removal. It's a broad suite of technologies, and it's a critical one for us to achieving net zero. And the reason is because there are truly hard to decarbonize sectors today that we just don't have good replacements for. So when we think about, for instance, aviation, long-haul trucking, and other parts of the transportation sector that are really, truly difficult to decarbonize. When we think about agriculture, hard to decarbonize, that we're going to need carbon removal in order to counterbalance the truly hard to decarbonize sectors, but not to be seen as an offset for sectors that we actually do have the technologies to decarbonize. And so we want to be really thoughtful about the scale of carbon removal, and still that it's required even on the order of gigatons when we look at just the hard to decarbonize sectors. And when we think about nature-based carbon removal today, we recognize that oceans, we recognize that the terrestrial biosphere removes roughly half of our emissions every year. But again, that comes at the expense of ocean acidification. And we also see that a lot of the nature-based sinks of carbon are becoming sources of carbon when we see wildfires and increases in greenhouse gas emissions and warming. And so it's really important for us to recognize carbon removal is a broad suite of technologies that include direct air capture, mineralization, the nature-based approaches. But the reality is that we don't have a standardization across all of these approaches in terms of whether or not we do something and modify improved forest management to increase the uptake of carbon, changing agricultural practices to ensure that the carbon is stored in soils. We need to understand what the baselines are today and how the technologies and applications that are taking place actually lead to additional removals, and that we have the tools to quantify how much carbon is removed. And for engineering-based approaches like direct air capture, we actually do have the tools, and so we can do that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that briefly. In the United States, we have a number of initiatives where we're really looking at trying to increase the technological readiness for demonstration of direct air capture. And so we have a number of initiatives. One at the Department of Energy is an Earthshot that we launched at COP in November last year. And there, what we're doing is we're investing in all of the removal approaches so that they can ultimately catch up, so that we have the monitoring and the reporting and the verification and all of those tools like we do have for engineered solutions coupled to geologic storage of CO2, but for the other solutions, the ones that are a little bit harder for us to be able to quantify. And so establishing standardization, MRV, across all the carbon removal approaches is critical so that we can be able to see that the measures that we apply are actually leading to additional removals, and also that the removals are durable. And what that means is that they are not leading to reversals of carbon to just be re-emitted into the atmosphere. We need to make sure that carbon is removed on a timescale that positively impacts climate. So it could be hundreds to 1,000 years. We want to make sure that as we do these approaches, that we are not reversing and that the CO2 isn't just simply re-emitted. Other initiatives that we have in the United States, we have recent legislation that's been passed. And one of those is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. In the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Department of Energy received $62 billion to invest for infrastructure for new, clean energy technologies over the next 5 to 10 years. And specifically $3.5 billion for direct air capture. And so there are technologies that are ready for demonstration today, but they're at the scale of thousands of tons of CO2 removal. By mid-century, in order for this tool to really be in our kit and ready to depend on, it needs to be on the scale of gigatons. And so that's significantly higher than today. In fact, it's 6 orders of magnitude in less than 3 decades that we need to scale up. That's significant. And so through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, with $3.5 billion for the first of a kind demonstrations on direct air capture that will lead to the scale of millions of tons of removal per year, means that we learn by doing. We make the cost transparent. In that way, the second of a kind, the third of a kind, the fourth of a kind are more economic. And so coupled to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, we also have the Inflation Reduction Act, which just recently passed, which provides a federal tax credit of up to $180 per ton of CO2 for direct air capture. And so that policy lever, coupled to the infrastructure law investments, is really critical for getting the private sector to be able to, in an economic way, build out the second and third and fourth of a kind. The other piece that I want to mention that's really critical is we also have funding for geologic storage of CO2. So managing the carbon after you capture it and re-injecting, putting the carbon back into the ground. Again, most of that CO2 in the atmosphere is from our dependence on fossil fuels, so we're really reversing the flow of carbon. And in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, we have $2.5 billion associated with building out the capacity of geologic storage of CO2. And not just in sedimentary basins, but we're also excited about mineralization approaches as well. And so a lot of momentum right now in the United States in this space in order to really get carbon removal at scale, but in a durable way such that it's a tool that we can depend on.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Sure.
And we'll come back with questions, and please, if you've got questions, we'll be able to take them from the audience by raising your hand or also by sending them in by the web chat, and we'll get them that way as well. Our next speaker is Gianna Amador, who's the Policy Director and co-founder of Carbon180, and she is coming to us remotely. Gianna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Gianna Amador, co-founder and policy director at Carbon180. Carbon180 is a climate organization that designs and champions equitable science-based policies that bring carbon removal solutions to the gigaton scale. We were founded back in 2015, really around the climate math, under the recognition that in order to meet our climate goals, we need to not only reduce emissions drastically and rapidly, but also clean up carbon that was already in our atmosphere. So today we work really closely with US policymakers, entrepreneurs, peer organizations to design and pass policies that can really bring the whole portfolio of carbon removal solutions to scale. So we focus on that full portfolio, including technologies like direct air capture and mineral-based approaches, alongside nature-based solutions, including forestry, soil carbon sequestration in the agriculture sector, as well as our oceans. So really excited to chat today about US federal policy, really what's happened so far and where we can go to scale carbon removal and help fight climate change. I will say just in the past few years, we've really seen a huge uptick in the amount of interest around carbon removal globally. We see companies like Stripe, Shopify, Microsoft, Meta making advanced market commitments for carbon removal and directly purchasing tons from carbon removal startups. We've also seen an increase in the number of large projects that have been announced, particularly for direct air capture projects. For example, there was a project from the startup Carbon Capture, Project Bison, that will be launched in Wyoming that will capture 5 megatons of carbon dioxide and will hopefully be operational in 2023. So a lot of this private sector action can either be attributed to or really accelerated by some of the policy support that we're seeing across the globe. And we're beginning to see a shift in these technologies from being very nascent and underfunded to really seeing support both from the public and private sector that's leading to these first of a kind deployments. So I wanted to touch on a few major policy developments that are happening in the United States. Dr. Wilcox touched on a few as well, so I can speed through those. But in 2022, we saw over $1 billion in funding for carbon removal solutions across the entire portfolio, across a number of different offices within the US federal government. And just to put that number in perspective, when Carbon180 was founded back in 2015, that number was effectively zero. So we've seen a pretty big increase in the amount of funding and the speed in which we're trying to develop these solutions. As Dr. Wilcox mentioned, the bipartisan infrastructure law provided $3.5 billion for 4 regional direct air capture hubs that would each at least capture 1 million tons of CO2, which would be the largest public investment in direct air capture to date, and really has the potential to demonstrate the commercial viability and scalability of these technologies. In addition to that, there's the carbon negative shot, which was launched by the Department of Energy with the goal to drive innovation around the full suite of carbon removal pathways and bring costs down below $100 per ton of CO2. 2 things about this program that I really wanted to highlight is that it's not just focused on innovation, but it's also really focused on responsible deployment of carbon dioxide. So thinking about including goals around creating good paying job opportunities, especially in relation to a just transition for fossil fuel workers, and also making sure that we're embedding climate and environmental justice for local communities as a priority in the deployment of these programs. There's also a lot of work happening outside of the Department of Energy at agencies like the US Department of Agriculture. The USDA just recently launched a Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities program where they awarded about $3 billion for the implementation of climate smart practices on agricultural lands. These climate smart practices include emissions reductions techniques, as well as practices that can store carbon in soils or in biomass on farms. And the USDA estimates that this program will encourage the implementation of about 20 to 25 million acres using these types of climate smart practices, and actually requires the grantees to do that robust measurement and verification that we know is so important to ensure the actual climate impact of these investments. And then finally, in the Inflation Reduction Act, we not only saw increases in the 45Q tax credit, which is an incentive to deploy direct air capture and storage up to $180 per ton of CO2, but also over $21 billion for climate smart agriculture and forestry practices under US Department of Agriculture conservation programs, including about $300 million to actually measure and better understand what our existing soil carbon stocks are today. And so I think with all of that policy support and momentum, we're at a really important moment to scale up these technologies and make sure that they're not only deployed, but also done so in a way that's really responsible and high quality. So meaning that it's in line with equity and justice, that they're sited in communities that want them, that drive local benefits and create high quality jobs, and also come with really robust science, meaning strong monitoring, reporting, and verification, as well as measures around transparency and accountability to make sure that we're actually delivering on this climate impact. And moving forward, I think policy can help sort of fulfill those two components and make sure that we're really scaling carbon removal to the gigaton scale needed for climate, but along the way really creates robust communities and jobs for the communities in which they're located.
Thank you, Gianna. Our next speaker needs no introduction in a crowd of experts on this topic. Julio Friedman is a globally recognized expert on this issue. He is a co-author and a leading intellectual force behind the ICEF roadmaps that address this issue. He's a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Energy Policy and senior research scholar there. Julio, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm always delighted to be at ICEF. Hopefully I can join you in person next year. I am now working at a company called Carbon Direct. Carbon Direct's mission is to remove CO2 from the air and ocean for fun and profit, and glad to be doing that. It's actually a good day these days. We have to get from 0 gigatons of removal today to about 5 gigatons in 30 years at a minimum. Next slide. That's a lot of work to do. But first of all, we've had a lot of policy changes that are good. Because we've had so much of it, next slide, we're going to roll forward pretty quickly to discuss the technologies themselves. First of all, CO2 removal is not one thing, it's many things. And some of these technologies are quite early, things like advanced cultivars or ocean alkalinity enhancements. Some of them are much more mature, like forestry or direct air capture. For the sake of time, I will speak about only 2 of these next, which are direct air capture and biomass. Next slide. Direct air capture, next slide. Oh, next slide, please. This is the plant in Iceland, the Orca plant. I was fortunate to be at the ribbon cutting last year for this. This removes about 4,000 tons of CO2 from the air and oceans every year. Next slide. They have already broken ground on the next project, which is about 10 times bigger. This removes 36,000 tons. The CO2 is mineralized permanently and kept from the air and oceans, as Dr. Wilcox requested. Next slide. Not to be outdone, there is a 500,000 ton project being built in Texas. This is being built by a company called 1.5, completely different technology base. The last ones were resorbent based. These are liquid solvent based. And they have already sold 400,000 tons of CO2 removal. Not to be outdone, now we have Project Bison, which is the biggest project that's been announced. This will remove 5 million tons of CO2 a year. So basically what we're seeing is a factor of 1,000 scale up in a very short period of time, which is really nice. It is not enough though. Next slide. We also have new technologies and companies coming on that are completely different. I want to mention one called Heirloom, which uses rocks to do the job as a sorbent. Another company called Captura, which uses go backwards please, that uses the ocean. Go backwards please, that uses the ocean as a contacting agent and removes CO2 through membrane technology. And then last, Verdox, which is a completely different technology, electrical swing absorption, in which there are neither solid nor liquid sorbents or anything else. It is just using electric catalysts to do the job. These represent radically different new technology approaches. All of these technologies have already dropped the cost of direct air capture and will continue to do so substantially and dramatically. Next slide. This other pathway, biomass with carbon capture, BECCS, is something that weighs heavily in the IPC studies. This is something familiar with all of these, with the experts here in the room. Biomass can serve as a conveyor belt from the atmosphere to the subsurface. If you have long, durable storage, then in fact you can do the job well. Next slide. One of the more promising pathways is not the power pathway, but the hydrogen pathway. Biohydrogen combined with CCS strongly removes CO2. In fact, it removes more CO2 than a steam methane reformer emits. So if you use waste feedstocks, things like municipal solid waste or forestry wastes, you can make hydrogen, which is a valuable fuel and feedstock, while removing large volumes of CO2. Projects like this are being announced right now around the world in places like Scandinavia, the southeastern United States, and California. Next slide. However, we want you to reimagine BECCS, bioenergy with CCS, and instead think about bikers. This was the topic of one of the ICEF roadmaps 2 years ago, in which storage and removal is done without conversion to fuels. You're just using the biomass as a conveyor belt, no energy product, just carbon removal products. Next slide. There are many different pathways to do this and many different companies that do so. Everything from putting kelp at the bottom of the ocean, to putting fibrous threads in cement, to cross-laminated timber. All of these remove CO2 in a durable form. Next slide. In fact, the value of that is higher than the value of the energy. This is one of the slides from the Bikers report. At a carbon price of about $60 a ton, it is in fact more valuable to store the biomass carbon than convert it to energy. Next slide. I'm just about at the end here. There are different technologies that do this. Pyrolysis is one that's coming on fast, which is excellent. There's a company called Charm that uses pyrolysis to make two products, bio-oils, which they inject underground, and biochar, which they add to soils. Despite all this progress on technology, and despite all of these excellent policy tailwinds, there remain substantial choke points and challenges. This next slide is the last slide. Oh, sorry, next slide, one more. One more. These are the main choke points. First of all is human capital. We may have the technology, but we don't have the people to deploy it. We don't have enough engineers. We certainly don't have enough electricians and welders. We do not have enough people to permit these projects. We do not have enough financiers who understand this. We need to dramatically improve the human capital understanding of all of these things. We just need more people. Next slide. We need infrastructure. The policies that Gianna and Dr. Wilcox talked about put some of that infrastructure in place, things like CO2 pipelines and storage sites. We're gonna need more. We're gonna need power technology upgrades. We're gonna need more hydrogen systems. We're gonna need all of these things in order to deploy these things at scale. We also need to move things like biomass and minerals and CO2 at global scales. We do not have the infrastructure to do that today. Nobody is tracking this. There's very little investment in this topic. Next slide. Last but not least, one more. Next slide. Look, I'll go back one. I'm sorry. Here we go. Thank you. We do not have enough projects. We have the technology that is not the same thing as a capital stack that enables a project developer to invest in a project. I have had conversations with many equity investors and bankers who say, bring me a project that's good, we'll invest in it. There are no projects. You cannot actually get $1.5 billion to build these facilities until you have a revenue model. Even with the policy tailwinds we described, that is not the same thing as 20 years of revenue, which means it's hard to get the financiers to invest, and it's hard to get the risk capital to put this to work. Policies like Dr. Wilcox mentioned and that Gianna mentioned help, but they are still insufficient. This is a substantial choke point that requires more work. With that, I thank you all for your attention and look forward to the other comments and presentations.
Thank you, Julio Friedman, the Chief Scientist at Carbon Direct. Our next speaker is Mr. Wataru Mizunasi, who is the Director General for the Bioeconomy Unit and Technology Strategy Center at NATO.
Yep, thank you very much for a kind introduction. and it is very honor to be here. And I'm curious to discuss about CDR in such excellent forum. And I have submitted a recorded presentation, so please start.
I'm Mizunashi from NEDO. Now, the importance of negative emission technology and CDR technologies are increasing as a view of realization of carbon neutral society. Today, I would like to talk about land and ocean related CDR, especially bio-related CDR among the negative emission technologies. Hereafter, I would abbreviate negative emission technology, including CDR, as NET. This slide summarizes NET. They are forest-based, soil carbon, sequestration, backstacks, and enhanced weathering and ocean-based sequestration. Looking at this whole picture, we can see many nets are depending on CO2 storage in the land, ocean, and underground. And many of them use biological functions, such as photosynthesis. I believe this suggests biological functions should play an important role for NET. This slide maps the reduction cost estimation and the current technology readiness level, TRL, of the NET, shown previous slide. Most of the nets are expected less than cost of $200 per ton CO2 in 2050. However, there are many technologies under development, so it is necessary to accelerate technology development for low net TRL. And it is important to establish appropriate system for social implementation of high TRL. For green and blue carbon, it is quite important to use biological CO2ification function. The big advantage is the ability of fixed dilute concentration of CO2 at low cost. On the other hand, when physically storing organic matter or inorganic mineral into the natural environment, it is important to make scientific evaluation of the environmental impact, including biodiversity. Both of forests and oceans have great CO2 absorption potential, so they are extremely important as CO2 sink. And various projects and measures are ongoing. On the left is an example of forest utilization. It is an initiative for circular forest utilization that can manage replacing old trees with young trees that have high CO2 absorption capacity. On the right is an example of establishment of industrial ecosystem around ocean through cultivation and aquaculture and industrial use of marine biomass for keeping CO2 sink. For sustainable availability of CO2 sink, it is important to create economic value and well balancing both of environment and economic values. Bio-related contributions are expected for utilization of forests and oceans. CO2ification activity can be dramatically improved by using advanced new breeding technologies, including genome editing, which got the Nobel Prize in 2020. Increased biomass can be used as renewable raw materials for various byproducts by using conventional chemical method and the advanced technology called synthetic biology or engineering biology. It leads to create economic value. And so there are many indicators for judging the resulting economic value. However, there are almost no indicators of environmental value, such as environmental regeneration, that makes effective use of biological functions or indicators of social value after adding economic and environmental factors. It is important to establish a methodology for indexing them. This slide is a summary of my talk. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. Thanks to our great speakers and their excellent presentations. We now have comments from my two co-moderators for this session, starting with Dr. Ismail Sarageldin, who's the Emeritus Librarian of the Library of Alexandria.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Yes, I'm a librarian. Before that, I was Vice President with World Bank and Chairman of the Agricultural Research System of the world, so I have a lot of experience with these kinds of projects. What I wanted to pick up on specifically was, of course, the wonderful presentations that we heard. Jen Wilcox mentioned removal should not be reversible, and I think that's extremely important. In addition to scaling up, we want to make sure that whatever we do in terms of carbon capture, removal will be lasting. And that brings me again to what was said by some of our other colleagues. And specifically, I want to go back to the fact that the agricultural product, the food and agricultural sector is a major contributor to the global emissions. And right now, about 33% of the total emissions come from there, partly from the farm gate, partly from land use changes, and partly from pre and post-production. And on top of that, we also have about 30% wastage, 15% in post-harvest losses and 15% on the consumption side. And that shows us that there's an enormous potential here. And I believe, especially with some of what Mr. Mizunasi was saying in terms of the kinds of approaches and so on, that we have room to have a major transformation and flip the sector from being a contributor to the emissions to being part of the solution by being a major negative absorber of CO2 and specifically also of methane. Now, some people may talk about, when we talk about these kinds of technologies, are we not creating a moral hazard for people to say, well, then we can continue business as usual, and these other things will remove the CO2 from the air and will remove the methane from the air and so on. I think the answer to that is clear. We are not on a path that will bring us to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. And if we are already at 1.2 degrees and you see what's happening with the hurricanes in Florida, with the floods in Pakistan, with the forest fires, with the heat waves and so on, I hate to think what it would be like with 4 degrees if we're only 1.2 degrees. So the issue is that we must act now, immediately, and move on. There is a lot of additional technologies that are being mentioned in passing in Mr. Mizunasi's slides that I would like to highlight. Specifically, that with the new gene editing techniques that we are developing in the biological revolution, we can tweak the genomes of trees. So as we reforest, the trees will absorb a lot more CO2 than they would have normally done. We can do the same with plants as well. We can do plants that will withstand puddling and will not drown and ferment and so on. So that the possibilities of the new science and the new technology is there. But we will have to reach down to the smallholder farmer because that's where a lot of the production of the world occurs, whether it's in India or in Indonesia or in China. And I think that the task of working local, national, regional, and global is going to be a big part of how we get these new technologies on board, but get them we must.
Thank you, Ismail. Our next co-moderator to speak, we're very privileged to have join us. She is a top advisor to President Biden on these issues. Her title is Deputy Director and Chief Strategist for the Energy Transition at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Sally Benson.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you here today. And anyway, thank you for those fantastic talks, which provided a great introduction to the topic. We heard from Dr. Wilcox why we need CCS. We heard about the exciting developments in the US government supporting demonstration projects. We heard from Ms. Amador about the private sector is also highly engaged in this effort, as well as the supportive policy actions that will catalyze even further private sector investments. We heard a tour de force of the technology from Dr. Friedman, and it's just so encouraging. Every time I talk with him, I learn about new technology, so that's super exciting. And the idea that we have projects on the books that will get us up to 5 million tons per year, that's extraordinarily exciting news. And finally, Mr. Mizunashi, talking about marine CDR in particular, in addition to the land-based biomass strategies. This is an incredibly important new development that is just beginning to get the kind of attention that is needed. So I just wanted to amplify on 2 points. The first has to do with why CDR is so important. And it really reflects the scientific understanding from the thousands of climate scientists around the world that we can't afford to add any more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere beyond, say, what would get us to 1.5 degrees C. Because every little bit we add to the atmosphere is going to increase warming. So this is a very profound scientific discovery, and that really motivates why we need CDR, is we know that we have to absolutely get to the point where we're not adding any more, either by balancing emissions or by getting to the point where we really have zero emissions and zero additional accumulation. So this is based on very, very solid scientific research that is now clearly come into light. So in addition to the topics or the reasons why we need CDR that Dr. Wilcox talked about, I also think about CDR as an insurance policy. You know, we always want to fall back. You know, yes, we're going to mitigate, a lot of things we're going to do. But this is a really complex issue, and we need to be investing in something that can work at scale, that will be available if we're not able to reduce our emissions as quickly as we'd like to be. So I think that's another way to think about why this is so critically important. The second thing I want to talk about is the importance of investing in R&D in this area. And, you know, we heard from Dr. Friedman that there are lots of exciting options, but all of these options, including marine-based CDR, you know, we need to make sure that they can be done cost effectively. So we'd like to reduce the cost, particularly for anything that requires engineered carbon removal. We also need to think about how do we reduce the energy use and the water use, and how do we make sure that all these processes they don't emit air pollutants, particularly ones that could be, you know, influencing communities who may live nearby. And for the nature-based solutions, we need to both establish and increase their permanence, because at the end of the day, again, we need to get to this zero additional carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. So because this is such a nascent, I mean, 10 years ago, nobody was talking about this. So we need to invest in a very broad suite of options, because at the end of the day, we don't know really which are the ones that's going to scale. We don't know which ones will be most cost effective. So I think that's very important to consider. And just one final thought, you know, if we're going to all the trouble of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and particularly if we're going to use direct air capture, you know, using engineered solutions, that why not also take the methane out? Why not also take the nitrous oxide out? So we can really think of this as a suite of technologies for atmospheric restoration, which will have not only benefits for CO2, but all these other greenhouse gases as well. So with that, back to you, David.
Thanks for those thoughts, Sally. I'd like to start with the question on politics and public acceptance, picking up on comments that both Ismail and Sally just made. And I'd like to relate a conversation that I had a couple of weeks ago in Pittsburgh, where I attended the Clean Energy Ministerial, and while I was there was at a dinner hosted by U.S. Department of Energy, which had maybe 20 or 25 energy ministers and their staffs, and it's a big dinner. And as we came out, there were protesters outside, or activists, I should say, and they were shouting, "Climate action now, climate action now," which I thought was very encouraging that we have this type of political mobilization on this topic. But there was a group of those protesters was also shouting, "No carbon capture, no carbon capture." And I ended up talking to one of them. And this woman made 2 points, and I'm interested in a reaction from any of our panelists on these 2 points. Because I said to her much of what I said earlier in the session, what other people have said, we need carbon capture, we need carbon dioxide removal for the prevention of the worst effects of climate change. And she said, no, no, no. She said, carbon capture allows fossil fuel companies to keep polluting, and you're just gonna let them keep polluting. And in particular, your carbon capture doesn't keep out local air pollutants, and those are hurting my community. And that's what motivated her to get out there and literally be, I thought it was quite ironic to have a Climate Action Now protester who was also shouting, stop carbon capture, because in my view, we need carbon capture to stop climate now. So do any of our panelists or speakers have any thoughts about kind of what's the best dialogue and response to somebody who's making those points? I see Jennifer's raising her hand. Yep.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick this off. I know others will have something to say on this topic too. One thing that I like to discuss, because I've also heard this argument, is that carbon dioxide is an acid gas. And so when we look at the separation technologies that we've developed to separate CO2, they also want to capture sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides as well. And so if these separation approaches are going to be effective towards removing CO2, we need to make sure that we reduce those competitive acid gases as well. And so some of the work that we're investing in at the Department of Energy is really making sure that there's momentum associated with investments in reducing NOx, reducing SOx, deeper than the technologies that we have today. So the technologies, like we have a selective catalytic reduction unit for NOx reduction for coal-fired power plants and natural gas-fired power plants. We have flue gas desulfurization for SOx. But those only get you down to, say, tens of parts per million, and that's still polluting. But if you can invest in polishing steps to get you down to single digits, number one, they don't compete with the carbon capture technology. And number two, you're reducing the air pollution from baseline, from what it was before. And so we do have an opportunity when we retrofit a cement plant, which isn't necessarily the argument associated with enabling fossil fuels, or if we're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, like in direct air capture, a critical tool to achieving net zero, we do have the opportunity to reduce air pollution when we're demonstrating and ultimately deploying these technologies. But the key is going to be monitoring air pollutants in addition to CO2 and being really transparent about that data so that we can communicate to communities these benefits and reduction of air pollution that these technologies can ultimately deliver.
Thanks. Other thoughts? I see Ismail, and then see if Julio has any thoughts on this.
Okay, very quickly, I mean, part of the answer is, again, the moral hazard argument that we addressed earlier on. The second part, I think, which is important, is to break the choke points that our colleague Mizumursi was mentioning, and also at the same time recognize that it's a global problem. Therefore, it doesn't have to be particularly in specific locations within the borders of my country. And we can think of creating a fund or a facility that will prepare the projects to take to the investors, prepare the projects in collaboration with various developing countries. And in so doing, they would be, in fact, helping also the global arrangement to bring $100 billion to support adaptation and resilience in the developing countries. The multilateral development agencies like the World Bank and others can provide funding that would link with the private sector funding in order to make this easily available, because the excuse that there are no projects to finance is an old one, and we have to help, I think, the poorest countries who need this. Specifically, getting the technology and spreading it at the level of the, for example, when we talked about agriculture smallholder farmers, or at the ocean level in the blue capture, blue CDR, at many countries that have coastlines, or Indonesia, 3,000 islands or so on. There's a lot to be done. And I think this is a potential to combine both the needs and also respond to the hopes of the poorer countries to get some support for adaptation and resilience.
Thank you, Ismail. We'll call on Julio in a moment, but first, if you have any questions here in the room, just raise your hand and we'll come to you, or by Zoom, please send them in just through the Zoom Q&A. I see Julio and Gianna both have their hands up.
Yes, thank you. And first of all, it's important to acknowledge that there remains a trust gap, that part of the reason why people are against CCS is that fossil fuel companies have not delivered on their promises in the past, that there continues to be concern about whether this is a bait and switch. I think that trust gap has to be acknowledged. I also think that the environmental community is not one community. There are many people with many different perspectives. There are certainly groups in disadvantaged communities who've borne the brunt of this problem, and they have questions and concerns. They should be conscienced and addressed. There are other groups, though, who will never take yes for an answer, who simply do not want to yield the premise. Carbon capture in general and CO2 removal specifically are the exact opposite of business as usual. It is actually taking custody of your pollution and managing it. And it is taking proactive steps to manage the climate. To argue also that they do not reduce pollution in communities is incorrect. Those numbers have been out for a decade. We know that where carbon capture has been applied as a retrofit, you do reduce emissions. I would point back to Dr. Wilcox's point. We certainly can do better. We certainly can go farther. We certainly want to demonstrate that with better programs that monitor and show that progress. But to say that carbon capture doesn't reduce pollution or is business as usual is contrary to the facts on the ground.
Thank you, Gianna.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what has been said by the other panelists so far. I think in this situation, it's really important to distinguish between CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, and carbon dioxide removal. And with CCS in particular being an emissions reduction strategy, often applied to electricity generation or heavy industry in a way that can get us to net zero, and carbon dioxide removal being a much larger portfolio of strategies that can really address and remove our historic emissions. And because of that sort of key difference, carbon dioxide removal can actually be developed in a way that's untethered from fossil fuels in a way that many CCS technologies cannot. I think one thing that's important to mention here is that as we're thinking about these first of a kind projects or these first projects at scale, many of which Julio mentioned in his presentation, these first projects will be make or break for communities in the ways that they think about direct air capture and carbon removal more generally. So I think it's really important that we think about making sure that these communities have resources for capacity building, that they have the resources they need for education, so that they can be really autonomous in decision-making about the ways that these projects are implemented in their communities, and really collaborate with policymakers and project developers to help provide oversight and input on how these projects should be deployed in their communities in a way that maximizes the benefits and minimizes harms for many of these projects, and making sure that those benefits and harms are really equitably distributed across the communities themselves. So I think we're at a really exciting inflection point to make sure that these projects are done well, but it's really about those first perceptions will have long-lasting impacts on the success of this field.
Thank you. Let's turn now just to opportunities in Japan. We are here in Japan. Thank you again to METI and to NATO for hosting this tremendous conference. And I wonder if any of our panelists have thoughts in particular about opportunities in this country for CDR, and just throw it open.
So if I may go first, the most obvious pathway is one we did not discuss very much here, which is mineralization. The entire nation of Japan is built on basaltic rock. They have substantial reserves of ultramafic rocks. These are good candidates for CO2 removal because, and in fact, those are thermodynamically favored pathways. Mineralization actually is exothermic, which makes it chemically favored. There are challenges associated with the kinetics. There are some challenges associated with particular approaches and costs, but this is a natural application for Japan as a nation. I would also point to some of the ocean CO2 removal pathways, including the blue pathways that Mizunasi-san had mentioned. Japan is not just a great nation in its own, it also is a steward of a grand ocean empire, and it has opportunities through its shipbuilding, through its maritime architecture, through its role at the IMO and so forth, to think about marine-based CO2 removal.
Great. Any other thoughts or comments on opportunities in Japan? And if you're, by the way, if you're interested in following up on the carbon mineralization point that Julio was just speaking about, that was the topic of our ICEF roadmap last year that Julio and I and a team of others helped to write. And if you're interested in the ocean removal point, please come to the lunchtime session today, where another group is going to be talking about their blue carbon research. So there's a lot going on in ICEF on these topics. Again, if there's anyone in the audience, please just raise your hand.
Just Sally?
Yep. Oh, and Sally, I'm sorry, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, yes. I was just going to sort of talk a little bit more about mineralization. So there are multiple strategies for mineralization. You can basically put reactive rocks in contact with the atmosphere, which will take carbon dioxide out of it. I think Japan has some very interesting opportunities for exploring that technology. And again, there's the opportunity for co-benefits for soil quality. But there are also opportunities for mineralization in the subsurface, much like is being done in Iceland, which requires volcanic rocks. And again, I think Japan is in an excellent position to explore opportunities for subsurface mineralization.
Great, thank you. Maybe just talk a little bit more about the policy environment here. We've talked about the policy environment in the United States. I wonder if any of our panelists have thoughts or comments on policy environment elsewhere around the world and any important trends that you see developing.
I think it's the real issue that I'm beginning to worry about very much is largely due to what's happening with the Ukraine war and the sanctions on Russia and the Russian weaponization of energy to Europe, where we are seeing some regressions coming in. People bringing online again coal-fired plants and so on, and therefore even talk, we already heard from COP26, talk about, oh, we will not reach net zero by 2050, but maybe 2060, maybe 2070, but that is extremely serious because as you're working very hard to try to even introduce the negative side of the equation, other people are bringing back again the more on the positive side at a time when we were hoping that we were just bringing these negative things as the positive side because the slope of the positive side wasn't fast enough. And that's a strictly political issue. But I think it's creating a variation in our expectations, and how quickly these things come on scale become extremely important, and how quickly we can maintain a pace of renewables and other parts of technology is extremely important as well. That's a new dimension I think we have to face up to.
Great. In a moment, McCall and Julio, his hand is raised, but we're getting down to the end of the session. I'm going to close the session by asking each of the panelists to, just for 15 to 30 seconds, give one message that they want to deliver to this audience as a takeaway. But Julio, and then I see Vali Musa has his hand up as well. Julio, floor is yours.
Thank you. Right. So we are starting to see policies develop around the world. In Europe, the DG Klima and the European Commission have launched something called Sustainable Carbon Cycles Program to help certify and pay for CO2 removal. We are seeing BECS and bikers projects all over Scandinavia, some of them quite large, the largest 800,000 tons a year at Stockholm Exergi. That is also supported by federal policy in Sweden. It is something that their state is doing. The Danish government is also doing something similar in this regard. We are starting to see policies emerge in the Middle East, and even in nations like Ghana and Kenya and India, we are starting, and very different technologies. In Ghana, it's biochar. In Kenya, it's mineralization and direct air capture. In India, it's soil carbon and biochar and BECS. But these different pathways suit the different nations of the world in different ways. And it's very rewarding to see so much of that. Like you, David, I had the good fortune of sitting at a round table with a dozen ministers at the Clean Energy Ministerial talking about CO2 removal. And from Nigeria to Chile to South Africa, nations want to get involved and they have opportunities to get involved.
Thank you, Julio. Vali, do we have a microphone for the front? If not, maybe you could just yell it out and we'll repeat it. Oh, there it is. I see the microphone's coming. Yep.
Thank you very much, David. I just want to take you back a little bit to the people who were protesting when you were speaking somewhere and saying no carbon capture. I think that's a very important point that you raised. Because for governments around the world, this question of carbon capture is just not as interesting as pictures of large solar plants. And so I think governments find it difficult politically to justify spending money on this technology. And that's a challenge that we have, those of us involved in this, to talk about the importance of this matter. When it comes to NGOs and other people, the problem I think that people have is they think that the powerful in the world want to continue burning fossil fuels and then remove it by carbon capture. They think that so there will be less of an emphasis on renewable energy and more of an emphasis on carbon capture. So do wrong and make it right. That's what they think. And I think it's a communication problem. I don't think that's what we're saying, but we're not reaching out sufficiently because this is a difficult area really to communicate. And then lastly, to make the point about historical justice, the NGOs and governments like mine and others are very interested in the question of historical justice. And if we place more emphasis on historical justice, this is something that can gain traction because Europe, the United States, everywhere, developed countries, and politically it is considered they owe the world removal of carbon from the atmosphere. And so I think if we place more emphasis on that and give the rich countries a way to address this political challenge of historical justice, maybe we will get some. So I'm saying overall, I think politically, we need to do a little bit more careful formulation on this thing because the technologies possibly are there, but the emphasis is not there. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Vali. Very powerful and important points. We are down to our last 2 minutes. We have 6 speakers, and let me just ask you each to make a very quick point that you think the audience should take away from this session. And I'm going to go in the order that we spoke at the beginning, starting with Jennifer.
Thank you. Well, I'll actually piggyback on what was just said. I think a critical piece is engagement. So when we look at investments in technologies, whether they're wind farms or solar panels or transmission lines, and in this case, carbon dioxide removal, we have to recognize that ultimately these technologies are going to be deployed in communities. And I think early engagement between the developers and the communities is critical, and really making sure that communities have a meaningful seat at the table. And Gianna mentioned this earlier, that there's veto power. If a community truly understands what the technology is, but they still choose not to want it to be at their fence line, then you move on, and you move on to communities that are excited about it and want to engage in the approach. The other piece is that there are a lot of ecosystem benefits to carbon dioxide removal. Direct air capture has the opportunity to reduce air pollution. A lot of the agricultural practices have the opportunity to reduce dependence on fertilizing, for instance. You have ocean-based approaches that can reduce ocean acidification. And so I think it's important to recognize what the ecosystem benefits are, the improvements that could be had, and that could be a way that we could really have these really powerful conversations with communities such that we don't feel this resistance.
Yeah, really, such important points. Thank you. And we're actually down to our last 15 seconds. I'm going to get in trouble with the organizers here for being a bad moderator and letting this run over, but I'm going to let's just take 2 minutes because we have such an incredible collection of talent here. If the other panels could just in 2 or 3 or 4 sentences make some key points, and I'll start with you, Gianna.
Great. Yeah, I think we're at a really exciting inflection point for the carbon removal field. And I think, as I mentioned before, we need to make sure that early deployments of these technologies and solutions not only result in technology learning, innovation, driving down costs, but also really meaningful, durable storage and demonstrable benefits for communities on the ground. And I think if we can do that with these first projects, we're really setting up ourselves to meet those very large, very ambitious gigaton scale numbers by mid-century.
Thank you. Julio.
We must do it, we can do it, and it'll make the world better.
That is concise and powerful.
We must do it because the climate math requires it. It's non-negotiable. We can do it because we have the technologies and pathways available, and it'll make the world better. It'll create wealth, provides a pathway to north-south redress, and in fact could be considered a form of climate reparations.
Love it. Thank you. Mr. Muzanasi.
Yes, so I will point out 3 points. First point is we need a solution mix for carbon reduction, not only 1 or 2 technology. So it is important to make a technology development, each technology. And second is we need to create economic value, not only environmental value. So for sustainable usage of such technology. And finally, so we need to to get 2 or more birds by 1 stone. So it means carbon reduction and also get economic value and also co-benefit. For example, rich forest and rich ocean to get a good society. It's my opinion. Thank you.
Ismail, couple sentences.
I think we need all the tools we can get. I agree with Julio's 3 points, but I think fundamentally it's not an either or. We need both and across a broad spectrum. But I do believe we need to do it locally, nationally, regionally, and globally. And I do agree with Julio that this could also be part of the North-South redress and justice and reparations.
Sally, you have the last word.
Okay. Anyway, these are early days in CDR, and it's so exciting to hear about the policy progress and the technology progress. But at the end of the day, we still need significant investments in R&D across nature-based as well as engineered carbon solutions so we can get this to the point where it's easy to scale to the gigaton scale that we need it at.
Thank you to Mehdi, Nito, and our chair, Nobuo Tanaka. Please join me in giving our panelists and speakers a big hand.